you get all these people that are trained just to give medications. And we had recently a few wonderful presentations where people had a wake-up call, eminent physicians that started to reconsider their training and then started to change their diet and had been advising patients with diabetes type 2 for decades to take just insulin, and then saw in their own body that within 1 or 2 months, diabetes has vanished. So it is actually a reversible disease.
Hi everyone, this is Veronica Kirilenko of the New American Magazine. The past couple of years have unveiled horrendous issues with Western governments and medical systems. As a result, many people begin to recognize that it is their personal responsibility to take care of their health and well-being. The undeniable fact that Americans have a problem with unhealthy diet and sugar consumption will surprise no one, but the extent of the sugar addiction problem and the long list of diseases associated with it might. Is there a way out of the sugar trap and all of the illnesses that come with it? Today, it's my honor to speak with Dr. Christof Plothe of Germany, a member of the steering committee of the World Council for Health, a neuropath, and an author who's been researching the topic of nutrition for 30 years. Dr. Plothe, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much, Veronica. It's a true pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. So many people just honestly can't imagine their lives without sweets. And many, of course, know that sugar is not a healthy food, but they may not realize just how much damage it can do to their minds and bodies. So please tell us what the health risks associated with sugar consumption are.
I mean, you just mentioned an important point. Many people can't even imagine to be without sugar in their daily lives. And if you think about it, it has not been for such a long time that we are in this frame of mind, because in the old days, think about what you had to do in order to get sugar. That was difficult. You had to fight with bees. You had to get some sugar canes, lick on them, and it was practically non-existent in daily nutrition even 150 years ago. That's when we started to basically get sugar out of the luxury item that it was beforehand. It made already the people that were the ruling classes in Europe. It had to be imported from all these foreign places, so you can imagine how precious it was in order to get some sweet. And for physiological reasons and evolutionary reasons, it was a good thing in order to feed on sugar in the old days, in order to get some fat reserves when it got colder. But certainly the amount that then we introduced in our society is not healthy at all. And we're talking about so many health problems, especially in the last 3 years, that keep us in fear. But actually, we should be much more afraid of the daily toxins. And today we're talking about sugar because the implications are huge. I mean, we're facing, look at the number one cause of death in our times, that's still cardiac disease. And the sugar industry has diverted in the 50s the whole thing into cholesterol, into the fats. But in fact, we do destroy our blood vessels with sugar. So it is partially responsible for this. Look at the diabetes crisis we have at the moment. You have an obesity rate of 41% in the States, and you have a diabetes a quote of about 11%, and in the over 65 that is 33%, and that's just the official numbers. Many people just don't even know that they're in a pre-diabetic state. So we can see it's huge, the impact on society. The costs are enormous. It was 137 billion for just obesity related diseases, because once you're obese, so once you introduce sugar in your system, you get predisposition not only for diabetes, not only for cardiovascular diseases, not only for dementia, because dementia is basically that's a diabetes type 3, because you reduce the receptors for glucose to enter your brain, and it's dependent on this. So you look at the main reasons for death and chronic disease in our modern world, and there it is. It's the direct consequence of sugar. And why can we say this? Because if you look in other countries and other societies that are not in this modern lifestyle, they don't have these rates of all these diseases. In fact, they have, if we talk about cardiovascular death in Africa, in most parts of Africa that haven't adopted to our diet, and in Asia, they don't even have it at all. They don't even have hypertension. So we'll have to reconsider what we're doing to ourselves. And unfortunately, yeah, we're talking about also about predisposing factors for much more severe disease as cancer. Yeah, so we have all these links. The science is there, and it's quite a scandal that we don't start at the basis, because, and that is what we take in our bodies in order to create health or disease.
So, doctor, yes, I must agree with you. And the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, I looked up its most recent report, and it says that you're right, heart conditions and cancer were both the leading causes of death for Americans in 2020, and diabetes placed eighth. So you said that all of these conditions are associated with the unhealthy diet, and particularly with sugar. But would you please explain this association in more detail? Why does sugar act like practically a poison to people?
Well, there are actually quite a few processes which are involved. If you think about the sugar that we're talking about here had been extracted from natural sources. So in nature, you have sugar beets, you have sugar canes. They have this entire complex of micronutrients. So that's what we used to do when we sweetened our food. But then we extracted this sugar alone, and to start off with, you take that in and you lose all those precious minerals that usually were involved in digesting the sweetener. So it actually gets your body is being robbed of essential minerals, magnesium, zinc, and B vitamins, etc. That's the first step. The second thing, it goes into your system, and what it does, it's so-called glycation. This is when you, for example, want to measure how detrimental your lifestyle with sugar has been. You get a sugar test in the morning, and then you also get HbA1c, which is a marker to see how much sugar has been attached to the red blood cells. So that's what you call glycation, and the sugar attaches to our blood vessels. It sticks to blood cells. It sticks to proteins, all kinds of structures in the body, and essentially deactivates them from their normal function. So that's one thing. If you could look at this glycation process in the entire body, then you have the effect that the brain depends on 90% on glucose in order to feed itself. And as we just said, it's almost a diabetes type 3. If you the body regulates its hormonal system, that when there's too much, it down regulates the receptors. So that's the insulin receptors in the brain. So therefore, you get less and less sugar because you get less and less entrance of this glucose into your system. That's where you get all these mental associations. And eventually, this is what we call dementia. So there are many reasons for it, but this is one process. In order to measure how far progressed a dementia is, you get radioactive glucose in your system, and then you see how much is absorbed in the brain. And in fact, in the demented people, you see that there's not enough glucose reaching the brain. So you have all this blood vessel destruction, especially important for the little blood vessels that supply all the organs, that supply our heart. And you can see that the main problems for our heart is salt, is fats, and is sugars. And these are all the three things that the industry has been pouring onto society, on the public. And we have this vicious circle that the same companies that produce all this food then are in ties with all the companies that make the medications in order to combat them. And the sad thing is that even the doctors are not trained in this. So they don't get any training in nutrition. That's not only in Europe, that's in the States as well. So you get all these people that are trained just to give medications. And we had recently a few wonderful presentations where people had a wake-up call, eminent physicians that started to reconsider their training and then started to change their diet and had been advising patients with diabetes type 2 for decades to take just insulin, and then saw in their own body that within 1 or 2 months, diabetes has vanished. So it is actually a reversible disease, and that we're not being told this, and that constantly new sugar sugar combinations are entering the market. And what's even worse, are marketed everywhere. No kid can survive without, I don't know how many sugar ads a day of food, from cereals to chocolate bars all day. So we get accustomed to something that slowly poisons us, and then the same industry makes a huge profit out of combating it. That's a very strange system. Yeah.
So you're implying that the industry is fully aware of the dangers posed by sugar. How about the healthcare regulators? What do they have to say about the risks of sugar and unhealthy diet?
You know, there was recently a congress in Copenhagen, in Denmark, here in Europe, and it was scientists that questioned the reliability of our science. So there was Professor Nides and other people that had been publishing about the reliability of the studies that we get, because that's for us as scientists, people in the medical world, people in the scientific world, peer-reviewed studies are the Bible. But if you look at the reliability of it, even the editor-in-chief of the Lancet admitted that up to 60% of all the papers in the big journals are fraud. They're basically fraud. Yeah, Professor Ioannidis is one of the most renowned epidemiologists, probably one of the brightest people on this earth. He says that up to 90% are actually fraud. And so you can see not only the education of the medical profession, not only the press that's being manipulated or dependent through all the ads, of course, feed the information that there's no big danger of sugar. You can go on the sugar website, sugar.org. I can only recommend. You can see it's very funny for me, but it's actually sad to see that they debunk every theory that sugar could cause any disease in our body, and stick to the fact that it's a healthy nutrition. And then you look at those medical boards and approval boards, advisory boards. You look at CDC, FDA, you look at EMA here in Europe. The EMA now has admitted that it's financed 90% by the industry. The same is for the CDC and FDA. We're talking about 80-90% financing by the industry that actually gains not only from selling all of this, but as we just said, also in combating this. So I do think, yes, they are aware, but it's a huge business. And then other criteria than health are the main criteria that people look at.
There is another question that I'd like to ask you, doctor, and it's related to the medical aspects of the sugar addiction. So there are studies that liken sugar addiction to that of illegal drugs, because in both cases, the same portions of the brain are activated. Would you please explain the physiological mechanism of this action in more detail?
Well, everybody who has been trying to cut out sugar out of the diet when they got used to it knows that it's quite a tough thing to do. And we know that the industry studies the so-called bliss point, which is when sugar, fat, and salt are put together by the measurement of how much dopamine is being released when consuming that particular food. Because dopamine basically is the endocrine equivalent of addiction. So the higher the dopamine release with certain food is, and this is what the industry actually does, it tests a new product in labs to see how much dopamine is released in the people that try it. And then they know that this will be the basis, the neurophysiological basis for an addiction. They made comparisons with cocaine. So they fed rats on cocaine and they fed other rats on sugar. And the rats that were fed on cocaine were 8 times less likely to go through all the cold bath, the electroshocks, and everything they had installed in order to measure how convinced the mice and the rats had to be in order to get to their addictive substance. So 8 times more addictive than cocaine. And they are fully aware of this. Yeah. And look at all the products out there. 80% of all the foods in a supermarket are basically with added sugar. You look at whether it's spicy, whether it's mustard, whether it's ketchup, whether it's a chili sauce. It's everywhere. And the main thing is that on the next day, you want that again. They know this, and it's well studied. And we know also that it's very easy to bring children to this addiction because they also did studies on the fact that if you have an emotional contact with a particular food in your youth, you're very, very likely to be addicted to it for the rest of your lives. You probably can recall something that you ate at a nice occasion with friends, with your family, and all these memories come back. They use this. So they make occasions where children have a wonderful event and then they feed them sugar because they know then afterwards they want that soda for the rest of their lives in order to get that same feeling again.
So it sounds like the food producers and pharmaceutical industry are just creating customers for life. Is it an accurate assumption?
I would say so.
Doctor, so how much sugar on average does an adult consume in America? I know that you've studied this in depth. And is there even such thing as a safe dosage of sugar from a medical perspective?
Well, that's an interesting point because if you look at all the different countries, they have different safety levels. And as I included at the beginning, most recommendations that are made in the individual countries, they talk about a safe input, a daily input of sugar. So what I mean is really crystalline sugar and not any other sweetener that we could still consider as potentially healthy. But in the States, we're looking at the moment of 126 grams per day, whilst the FDA says that it's about 50 grams that you can consume safely. And the WHO, for that matter, just to show another number, talks about 25 grams that are still safe. But the fact is, as we just outlined the mechanisms in which sugar can interact with your system, there is actually no safe amount of sugar. It will have the effects. And if you think about it, 25 grams, that's even a handful. Yeah, that is a lot. Yeah, and if you compare it with any other food that you're consuming, anything that you add to food, that is probably the number one substance that you add. In salt, you need much lower concentrations to already have a detrimental effect. That's another big subject. But the mechanism is the same, because you can actually also get addicted to salt. We get addicted to salt, fat, and sugar, as mentioned. And this is one of the basic principles of we see it in our school lunches, we see it in hospital foods. Why are all these highly addictive and unhealthy substances fed to people that are in the middle of their development and need completely different input? Why is it being fed to people that are actually sick, and we know they're sick? It was actually, if I may just say a personal story, I was working a night shift, and I was as a student, and I was together with a professor, and asked him, when he asked me to deliver to calculate that we didn't have it all automated at that time, to calculate the amount of insulin for a patient that he should get. I asked him, well, if you had to look at the lunch that he had today, it was full of sugar. Shouldn't we take away the substance that actually makes them sick instead of just calculating the medication that they need afterwards. It's like pouring lead into somebody and then calculating how much detox medication he needs in order to get the lead out of the body. And said, I never thought about this. So this was an eminent professor at a university hospital that that actually questioned this, and this was for me the reason to leave mainstream medicine and going into osteopathy. So technically, I'm not a doctor here in Europe, but I'm an osteopath. But that was for me an eye opener, yeah. And that's basically how far the medical system has been detached in order to see that we should first ask about the cause of something before we get further.
Yes, true. And it appeared to me, you just said that studies on mice show that sugar is 8 times more addictive than cocaine. But we know that with drugs such as cocaine, usually drug addicts need to increase their dose in order to feel happy and satisfied. Does it work like that with sugar too?
Well,
Do people
one of the
need to increase their sugar consumption?
Well, one of the mechanisms that has to do with another hormone when you start consuming sugar is that usually there's leptin in the fat cells, and that usually signals the body it's enough. You don't shouldn't eat anymore. That calms down your hunger. The problem with sugar, and it's the only substance that we know, it goes to these fat cells and inhibits the release of leptin. So you lose your sense of loss of hunger, of appetite. This is a vicious circle, and you can imagine the more sugar you eat, of course, yeah, the more you want to eat it. Absolutely, yeah. You have several mechanisms that are well studied. Yeah, you just strive for more and more and more. Yeah.
So
just observe your kids.
of course. So the most important question is, how can one overcome sugar addiction?
Well, like in any other addiction, there are different personalities on how you can approach it. You know, the anonymous, the alcoholic anonymous. What do you call them in English? Yeah, they're just saying avoid it altogether. Yeah, and otherwise you will always fall back into the trap. For sugar, for some people, this might actually be the only way to get out of it, but that's a tough one. But in general, I would start with basic steps. Go into your home and check all your cupboards and look for what contains sugar. You will be surprised. but start with this, and then don't have it available when the sugar craving comes. Number two, try to think that one of the things that sugar does that we haven't talked about yet, it changes your microbiome. So you actually, with a few sugar consumptions in a row, you change the bacteria that are in the gut, which are actually not healthy for us. Sugar does not promote the good ones. Yeah, the microbiome controls almost every physiological aspect in our body. So you have different types of microbiome, which then has the effect that we actually crave even more. So that's one of the aspects that if you were obese and you might change your diet, some people have really hard time losing weight, but actually it's their gut bacteria that hasn't changed since they introduced the sugar. So we need to change the microbiome. So get fresh fermented food, make them yourselves, sauerkraut, ferment juices, whatever. That's the easiest way to get a microbiome. You don't have to go into probiotics, just get out there and eat fermented foods. The other thing is increase potassium. This has been shown in studies that an increased potassium, like kale and other vegetables, are very high in potassium. That actually calms down that sugar craving. So each time you have that longing for some sugar, just consume some potassium containing kale, and you will see that will calm down. These are a few basic steps. And another advice that we give to patients is to use bitter essences. You know, the spices that are responsible for our bitter sensation when eating something. There are whole mixtures of different herbs that you can use for that. The advantage is that they stimulate gall flow from the gallbladder, which usually is at the end of a meal. So what this implies for the body, when you take some bitter essences, that you just finished a meal. So you're more likely to stop the craving. And the other thing is just with a very, very basic thing, try to get rid of all the snacks in between. This might be hard at the beginning, but try to stick to 2 or 3 meals a day so you don't fall all the time into this hypoglycemic holes, because once you've eaten sugar, 2 to 3 hours later, your glucose levels will be so low that you just long for getting sugar again. Yeah, this is, many know this. If you've eaten a sweetened cereal in the morning, 2 to 3 hours later, you really need something in order to keep on going. And you can avoid that by just looking at what's there. Don't use that sugar in the food, and stick to regular meals. And the other thing is, of course, try to replace all sugars in your home with natural substances like date syrup, like honey, like molasses, and like other syrups that come directly from nature, which still contain everything. Be careful in their use. But one point maybe here, all the artificial sweeteners, because that's a thing that's often asked, shall we use the artificial sweeteners? They don't have any calories. Well, artificial sweeteners are actually used in order to get pigs to grow much fatter and bigger since the 1950s. So they have the same effect in our system. They also stimulate insulin release. The whole low fat and low carb and these diet helps with the diet soft drinks that you can get everywhere. They don't have that effect at all that prevents you from having all the side effects that you have with consuming sugar.
Wow, Dr. Plothe, I would like to thank you so much for taking the time to unwrap such a complex issue for us. And please tell us what's the best way to follow you and your work.
Well, I always like to refer to the associations that you mentioned at the beginning. I'm a steering committee member of the World Council for Health. That's an organization which tries to teach people to be healthy again, because, as we mentioned, it has become so hard to find a source that you can trust. I'm not claiming we have all the truth, but I'm saying we try to extract the things that are important for our lives, and are open to any discussion, open to any opinion, because that's what science is all about. It's about different perspectives. And yeah, so maybe everybody who wants to look at World Council for Health is therefore invited to take a look at the website.
Thank you, Doctor.
You remember when everyone bought all the toilet paper? And they wanted me to wear these things? And someone invested a lot of money into this stuff. There's just too much baloney out there. At the New American, they cut through the baloney and give me the truth.
Being informed is important, but being informed with the truth is essential. Visit thenewamerican.com for news you can trust.